Hi, I'm Kalina Eck.
And I'm Carrie Chilton. We're staff attorneys with the Disability Law Center of Virginia, and we'd like to talk with you about the basics of behavior today. We know a lot of parents have no idea what to expect in the functional behavioral assessment and behavior intervention plan process. So we wanted to take some time to explain the basics of behavior so you can be a meaningful participant in the IEP and behavior intervention plan development process. The very basics of behavior start with the ABCs: antecedent, behavior, and consequence. Antecedent is just a fancy word for what happens before. What is the trigger that leads to the behavior? This can be tricky because behavior doesn't occur in a vacuum. There may be delayed antecedents, just as there are more immediate ones. Antecedents can be internal or external. The behavior is the action or thought or speech that you're focused on. In the school context, this usually focuses on undesirable behavior, but as we'll talk about more on the next slide, behavior is much broader than just the behavior getting our students into trouble. Behavior is not inherently bad. And consequence is what happens after the behavior, that serves to make the behavior more or less likely to happen in the future. These can be natural consequences or artificially imposed.
There are a lot of different definitions for behavior, but broadly speaking, it's anything a person does. This can include verbal behavior like speech, moving around, interacting with the world, and even more private behavior like thinking. Basically, if it's alive, it has a behavior. A lot of times, when we talk about behavior in the school and student world, the focus is on behavior that we don't like. But behavior is not just bad or disruptive. Behavior can be neutral or good, even desirable. Those of you who have seen some of our other videos or presentations know I spend a lot of my personal time hanging out with behavior analysts, and one of my favorite behavior analysts likes to say, if you aren't noticing the good behavior, then you're not reinforcing it. You're not working to make it more likely to happen. So make sure in your meetings or discussions, you're talking about more than just the bad stuff. When you're talking about behavior you would like to change, that you'd like to make happen more or less often, you should define that behavior as specifically as possible. Sometimes we see students getting in trouble for disrupting their peers. While perhaps accurate, that's the result of the behavior, as opposed to tapping her pen repeatedly, which is more specific.
You're probably with us today because your child's school or teachers or IEP team are talking about a functional behavioral assessment, FBA, and behavior intervention plan, BIP. As a brief overview, these are some of the most common tools schools use to meet their obligation to take a proactive approach to making sure students don't have behaviors that are going to get them in trouble in the school setting. Students can also have behavior goals written into their IEPs, hopefully informed by the FBA BIP process. The road to getting a BIP in place starts with an evaluation we call a functional behavioral assessment, an FBA. We encourage you to take a look at the materials on our website about evaluations generally, but you should know that, like all evaluations, if you disagree with the school's FBA, you can request an independent educational evaluation, or an IEE, for an FBA, which the school must either pay for or challenge via due process. Who should complete an FBA or BIP? Just like you probably wouldn't have a PE teacher conducting a reading assessment, functional behavioral assessments shouldn't be done by just anyone. Years ago, we had a case where the school principal, who had no background in behavior, was doing all of the FBAs and BIPs for the school. As with all evaluations, they should be done by trained and knowledgeable personnel. Behavior analysts are now licensed in Virginia, so that would be my first choice. You really want someone who knows what they're looking at doing for these assessments. One quick word of caution before we go further. Before you talk about addressing a student's behavior, you'll want to make sure you've ruled out any medical causes for the behavior first. Things like blood sugar levels and thyroid function are just two examples we've seen in our practice that have affected a student's behavior. And the best BIP in the world isn't likely going to be helpful when the root cause is medical. We're not doctors or clinicians, so please talk with your child's doctor about any potential medical reasons for their behavior as part of this FBA BIP process.
Ultimately, you want a BIP that figures out why your student is doing whatever behavior it is that's getting them in trouble and details how to make that not happen anymore. So there's a 10-step process that goes like this. First, verify the seriousness of the behavior. As an example, we'll say a student is annoying the teacher. Is this a big deal? Maybe, maybe not, or something worth developing a plan for. Once we determine this is a big enough problem that it needs an intervention, we look to define the behavior we're targeting. Tapping a pen, speaking without being called on in class. The more specific, the better. Though I will caution going too far. I once had a client whose disciplinary review team decided the behavior in question, saying a specific curse word, wasn't a manifestation because while they had a BIP in place to deal with him shouting curse words, this was a new and different word than they had planned for, so define the behavior reasonably specifically. All right, so then someone, ideally a behavior oh no, what'd I do?
No, that's good.
Okay.
Start with the
So then someone, okay. This is slide 5, attempt 3. Then someone, ideally a behavior analyst, but it could be a teacher or parent or someone filling out an observation form the behavior analyst designed, collects information on the reasons for the behavior. This can be direct observation or review of the discipline record, interviews with the student, parent, teachers. Then the behavior analyst gets to work analyzing the data collected, looking for patterns, looking for those ABCs being repeated, and develops a hypothesis, an educated guess, about why that student is doing that behavior. And then verify that hypothesis and create a behavior intervention plan. These are the positive and negative reinforcements we'll use. This is how we'll reduce or change the presentation of the antecedents if we can, that kind of thing. After the plan is made, you still need to evaluate the delivery of the BIP. Is this a plan everyone who needs to implement can implement? And the effectiveness of the BIP. Is this plan, when implemented perfectly, working? And after that, make some changes based on that new information.
Consequences come in 4 basic types. Consequences can be positive or negative, punishing or reinforcing. So you can have a positive and negative reinforcement and a positive and negative punishment. Think of positive and negative like you would in math. Positive plus sign, adding 2. Negative minus sign, taking something away. Reinforcement is usually something you like, something that's more likely to make you repeat what you've done. Punishment is an adversive, something you don't like. These are not universal. Not everyone finds the same things reinforcing or punishing. As an example, some kids love candy, others don't. Some kids really care about their grade on an assignment. Others aren't moved by it one way or the other. Some kids hate running laps. Others love it. So make sure any reinforcement selected is actually something that makes the behavior more likely to happen again. We have some examples up on this slide of each of the 4 types of consequences. Positive punishment, that's writing out lines repeatedly, running laps, that sort of thing. Negative punishment is things like timeout, taking away your toys for 2 weeks. Positive reinforcement is your paycheck for going to work, a good grade on an assignment. Sometimes people say positive reinforcements is a bribe, but the big difference here is that where a bribe comes before a behavior, the reinforcement comes after. And the same payment used as a reinforcement is much more likely to be successful. So saying, if you sit in the cart quietly at the store, we can get ice cream after, is going to be much more successful than, we'll get ice cream now, but I expect that you'll sit quietly in the cart at the store. Negative reinforcement is taking out the trash because it stinks, and after you take it out, it smells nice in your kitchen again. Turning down the volume of a loud radio, taking off your shoe to shake out a pebble. I will caution you here and say that if you see punishment used in a BIP, that's a red flag. What you really want a behavior plan to focus on is reinforcing the behavior you want to see.
Reinforcement can happen a few different ways, and each has their benefits and limitations. This may not come up in your discussions, but just in case it does, you'll know what the terms mean in actual practical use. Continuous reinforcement happens after every single time the behavior you're looking to increase happens. which is pretty time and resource intensive, and not a great way to keep a behavior going without that reinforcement or reward. So your other option is partial or intermittent reinforcement. In these, the reward or reinforcement happens less often than continuous, based on either a ratio, a number of behaviors, or an interval, a time period, and can be fixed or variable. We've got some examples up on this slide to give you an idea of what these schedules look like. But the model used in a slot machine payout, where the behavior of hitting the slot machine button gets rewarded after an unpredictable number of times, is the strongest method for getting a behavior to stick. Keep these schedules in mind when you're talking with the IEP team about the BIP and figuring out what's going to work best for your student and their classroom setup. Also keep in mind that you're reinforcing behavior, not people. So the timing of when the reward or reinforcement is given is extremely important. The most effective reinforcement happens immediately after the behavior. The longer it takes to get the reinforcement after the behavior happens, the weaker that reinforcement is and won't be as effective.
Behavior isn't just a concern for students with disabilities. And as schools in Virginia move to using PBIS, Positive Behavioral Supports, school-wide, these behavioral interventions and concepts are found and applied in nearly every classroom. Two examples I'd like you to think about are the behavior color chart, where the chart is posted somewhere public in the classroom with students' names on a clip that is moved up or down depending on their behavior. An example you may know as a token economy system. A smiley face chart where students can earn smiles to be turned in for something reinforcing after a certain number are earned. The behavior chart and the smiley face chart are slightly different from each other, as the color chart includes a mix of positive reinforcement and punishment, whereas the smile chart, unless smiles can be taken away, provides just positive reinforcement.
As you're talking with the IEP team about BIPs and behavior goals, it's important to have an idea of what the end game looks like. What happens when the behavior goals in the IEP are met? Is there more work to do and new goals that we'll need to follow? If so, you'll probably be looking at modifying the BIP to meet those new goals. Or once the goals are met, if everything is pretty good, and we just want the student to be able to maintain those behaviors on their own, there needs to be a plan to fade or taper off the reinforcer. Some reinforcers you don't want to or expect to fade. I love my job, but I wouldn't be very likely to show up to work every day if I weren't being paid. But in the context of the BIP, you'll want to work with the team and behavioral professionals to include a plan to decrease the delivery of reinforcers while still maintaining the behaviors you want to see. One thing to keep in mind as the BIP gets put in place and you're working to reduce or eliminate a particular behavior is something called the extinction burst. Extinction burst works like this. The behavior you don't like has been reinforced or rewarded before, and now you've stopped reinforcing it. That behavior increases in frequency, trying to get to the reward it's gotten before. So even with a great BIP in place, things may get worse before they get better. The good news is, if you stick to the plan and don't provide the reinforcement at that burst, the behavior will reduce and eventually disappear entirely. Those of you who have gotten through the infant stage as a parent will be familiar with this if you've tried any version of the cry it out method to teach your child to sleep. With that in mind, it is important to keep the long-term goals in the back of your mind while you're talking about behavior plans with the team. So often the focus is only on stopping the behavior in the moment. As you're evaluating the plan, and as the plan is put in place, think about how these reactions, these consequences, set up the behaviors you want to see going forward. Thank you for joining us. We hope you found this information helpful. For more information about other special education topics, please see the resources available on our website. You can also find our contact information online.